Hello, this is Adam Watson at Watson EdTech, and welcome to the Blended Learning Basics video series. This is video number 3, where we're going to be talking about taking the blended learning theory that we were discussing in the previous video and trying to apply it to actual practice. And as far as the learning targets, we're now addressing the second of our learning targets from the beginning of our video series, where the hope is that you are going to understand how blended learning can transform teaching while also working within best practice pedagogies that you're already doing, and be able to do that by the end of this module. I should mention from the beginning that the diagram that we have broken apart and labeled and identified for the majority of this video came from a great website resource called Ready to Blend, and that's readytoblend.com is the website. Heather Staker, who is one of the co-authors of the blended book that I mentioned a few times now in our video series, is the majority person behind this website, so it's definitely worth the look to look at different aspects and resources for blended learning. With that said, let's look at a couple of different classrooms. And the first classroom is kind of before the aspects of thinking about blended learning. It's a more traditional environment. And we're going to start off, as we see here in our diagram, with a teacher beginning the block of time with a whole group instruction for conceptual development. And then that's followed by some individual practice. They're released to do that work, and it's accompanied by a teacher's strategic monitoring. And then at the end, there's probably a catch moment where the teacher does a reteach, sees where they're at, maybe emphasizes or summarizes a point. And the day will end with some kind of exit ticket where the teacher will use that information to plan the next day's whole group instruction. A pretty solid, pedagogically speaking, instructionally sound piece of traditional classroom work. But I want to pose some questions for you and think about that as we pivot into more of a blended learning experience that takes where we're at here and goes forward. First off, pay attention to how students are sitting. And what we're seeing is a pretty traditional grouping of students. There may be a little bit of movement, although maybe not tons, as far as in the classroom environment. The idea of where the front of the classroom is pretty evident. You have a teacher in 2 out of these 3 pictures here where clearly the front of the classroom is here with the teacher as the sage on the stage, right? There's a little guy on the side going on here, but the front of the classroom is fairly established by that. And the last question here is thinking about what pedagogical delivery model of instruction does this sound most like? Giving you a minute to think about that. If you're thinking workshop, you're going to get the gold ribbon here, because that's absolutely true. You have the hook in the beginning, you have the release here for them to compose and to work, and then you come back together in a reflective moment at the end. In general, you're creating a workshop type of situation. I want to emphasize, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with workshop. In fact, workshop itself is a very sound pedagogical method of delivering instruction. What we're saying here and trying to show in this video is an example of how can we take something that we know is solid and works and create a deeper experience thanks to the blended learning methodology or the blended learning models that we've learned about in the previous 2 videos. So with that in mind, as we transform and think about a transformative experience, we're going to, in this particular example, use flipped learning as our model. So as we progress through the next pieces of the diagram, note how these steps still follow really the idea of workshop. What is changing in the idea of workshop is, first off, that there's a lot of digital tools that are going to be mentioned and referenced. But secondly, that the idea of pace and timing and place when and where those steps of workshop occur is changing. And remember that in our definition of blended learning, the 4 elements of pace, path, place, and timing, those 4 elements were super essential in what we define as personalized learning, but also in particular our totality of the blended learning definition. So again, note how those things are shifting and changing in this version, in this transformative blended flipped learning model. So first, the thing that we noticed is that there's some work the night before. The students watched the flipped video that's provided by the teacher, and that there's some kind of opportunity where the students do an accountability piece, an assurance, if you will, that they did experience that video and took in some of that learning. And that in the best of ways, hopefully that information is digitized in a way that the teacher, even the night before, much less the next morning, can look at that information and make some implications and changes about the day ahead as far as how am I going to instruct the students based on their acquisition of knowledge the night before. So let's look first at the students watching the flipped video. Again, in the flipped learning model, you often see it's a recorded lecture, perhaps even made by the teacher, him or herself. Could be a Khan Academy video. Neither of those two things are wrong. But I do want to pose as far as an opportunity to think about what are some other different things that might be content acquisition, creation, and opportunity that isn't quite as straightforward and maybe even a little bit more engaging than that. So I give an example, the PBS Learning Media website has some great, especially for the elementary or K through 8 student, with the animation and the built-in materials. It's maybe a little bit more engaging than maybe what might be considered a little bit more dry, straightforward approach of a lecture video. TED Talks are great videos. As adults, I think we've all seen and experienced that. In case you didn't know, TED Talks also has a TED Ed website that provides an opportunity to ask some really great, interesting, engaging questions to kind of hook an audience member of thinking about science or social studies or other content areas in a different way. Those kind of videos might be a great way of getting the conversation started and the student learning and curious and inquisitive before they come into the classroom. And last but not least, I give you a third example of Legends of Learning, which is a website that takes game-based learning approaches, in particular in the content areas of math and science. So you might think, wow, playing a game, but yeah, playing a game could be a great opportunity for a student to first engage in some content, do some learning in a highly engaged way. So after talking about the video, just talking about how is the data going to be created? What's that information? What are ways that information could be created for a student to do something that the teacher could look at? So there's ways that they could be doing some assessment during the aspect of actually watching the video, or possibly reflecting on the content afterwards. So again, very briefly, just wanted to walk through those examples. You have Edpuzzle, which is a online tool opportunity where the video that you have queued up actually stops at certain key moments, and the student has to answer some questions before they can even continue on with the video. So there's a great way of not only an assurance that yes, you know that John Smith actually watched the video, but the answers and the way they answer could give you some great ideas as far as how well they're maybe approaching that content. Kahoots have been a very fun and engaging way of doing things in a classroom, but Kahoots in the last few years also has an opportunity where you can play some Kahoots at home. Again, it's a gamified kind of feeling, and it's just another way of trying to A, make sure that they actually did the content acquisition piece, but B, give you some data about how well they're learning that content. Nearpod, if you have the premium version, there's ways that you can do Nearpods, which are guided presentations. They could do those at home asynchronously instead of being led live by you as a teacher in a classroom. Another opportunity to not only get content, but also do some interactives as that Nearpod is done. A Google form, simple and straightforward as that. It at least is a digital way you could ask some questions to get the student to answer them. Keep in mind, Google Forms can also have videos embedded inside of a Google form, which could create that opportunity to watch this video, answer these questions as you watch. You could have a reflective tool, and you could create that as a Google Doc that could be pushed out as a template that students could do on their own and then digitally turn into you. But frankly, it could also just be printed out and handed out as a paper and pencil way of the students answering and reflecting as they are watching with that video. And again, it makes learning more active than just passive, not just merely watching the video, but thinking critically. And again, we're not trying to, although there's nothing wrong with multiple choice questions or ways to assess that way, that's an assessment tool as well. But the main thing here would be a reflective opportunity where they are actually thinking about the learning as they experience it. So just to kind of visually show that very quickly, here's what that might look like. You might have an opportunity for to talk about vocabulary and the way they think about those definitions, summarizing the content, the most important thing to remember from coming from that video, questions they still have, and understanding they gained. And for students that may have a different approach to learning or a different lens of learning, this might be an opportunity to do some picture diagramming, doodling, to capture their thought process as the video is going on. And if it's math oriented, maybe they can include a few practice examples that were given in the video to capture here for later looking and discussing. So again, as far as digital data and creation, again, the idea here is that we are not only creating the content for them to do at home, but also creating ways for that digital data to be assessed as the day begins the next day. So the next day you have learn a different practice using several feedback sources. Feedback from peer tutors. Maybe there's some answer keys at a teacher's desk. There's software that's giving feedback. The feedback you gave through one of these digital tools. Next, the teacher is giving targeted instruction for specific lesson objectives to small groups of students that need it. And that's again based on how they answered and what they said and what was accomplished the night before can help drive some of that instruction. And if it's digital, it's going to be a lot quicker to assess and collect. Now, for the students that already have it, or you've assessed or determined they got this, you could have the students who master that lesson move forward. And that's kind of going back to what we talked about as far as pace, right? So there is the idea that some students are moving along with the learning faster than others. Thinking about, for both of these areas, what are ways students can work independently and digitally while the teacher's walking around in these small groups? While certain students don't necessarily need that and perhaps they're moving forward, here's some things to think about. Again, we want to have data to assess later. So they could use adaptive learning systems like Dreambox and Core 5. If you have that opportunity in your environment to do that, that's a great way of students to do that while waiting for the small group instruction to begin from the teacher, or perhaps as a moving forward opportunity. We have Empower as our learning management system, so they could do an activity or playlist that they're working on while you're waiting to do some small group instruction. Or you might have an activity or playlist that's meant for prepping a student that's moving faster than the others. You could have flip content for tomorrow's lesson. Go ahead and have the student interact and deal with that today while they're inside the classroom. They could have additional time to work on a project-based learning project. They could have independent reading and that they're filling a reading log. So again, it's both work and also a piece of how can I look and assess and give feedback of that student later. Is being captured here. So it's a 2-for-1 that's important to note. So from all this work, we have individual practice accompanied by that teacher's strategic monitoring and occasional small group instruction, as we've been talking about. And at the end, an exit ticket to check for understanding, and you can see that the cycle just continues on. So that gives us some data about maybe what information or what things we want to do next. Perhaps what to set up in the next day or two as far as another flipped learning video or experience, for example, and the cycle of instruction continues. So based on what we're talking about, we took what was a pretty typical, solid workshop model delivery instruction classroom experience, and then we just layered onto it what a blended learning of, in particular, a flipped learning model might look like inside or with that. So consider the blended learning model that you chose to shift to in the near future. This is one of the reflection questions at the end of our second video. What are some first steps that you can do to integrate your best practice pedagogy with this blended model that you've picked that you want to try to shift to? So reflect and think upon that. And with that, we've completed our third video, and we'll see you on the next go around.